Hello folks, we're going to just give it a couple minutes here, but I hope you hang in. We're going to make some Irish coffees today using our Teeling Whiskey. So nice to be back. Glad that you're here. Hang tight. We're going to get started in about a minute or two. Get into making an Irish coffee on a Thursday night. Just what you need to stay up. Six o'clock on the hour. We're here with Jack's Liquor's Instagram page. Thank you for joining. Nothing better than that's right. There is nothing better than a good Irish coffee. It's one of the most fantastic drinks you can have. Well, it's 6 o'clock. We are live. Thank you for joining us today here on Jack's Liquor Store's Instagram page. They have been very generous in allowing me to come in and talk to you about some of our wonderful spirits in the Bacardi portfolio. My name is Kevin Brownlee. I am the portfolio ambassador with Bacardi, and one of the wonderful spirits that we're going to talk about today that I get to represent is Teeling Irish Whiskey. Now, Irish whiskey is the fastest growing category in the spirits world right now, and this is a nice revival for this category because at the turn of the 20th century, there was a demise for Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey was at one point in the late 1800s the number one export for spirits across the globe, and Dublin was a cosmopolitan city center on the global scale. And so the Teeling family, who we're going to talk about today, were a huge part of the Irish whiskey revival. Teeling Irish whiskey is made in Dublin. It was the first distillery to reopen in Dublin after 120 years. And it's a really wonderful way to experience whiskey is through the expressions that this family has done. Now, their family has been involved in the Irish whiskey category since 1792. Generations and generations of this family have been involved in it. So it's two sons, Jack and Stephen, who have lived on from their great-grandfather's legacy, and it was their father in 1987 who opened a distillery outside of Dublin known as Cooley. Now, at Cooley they were making all different types of whiskey, but in Irish whiskey, most of those whiskeys are blended. It's important to know what you're drinking. And so in Irish whiskey, most whiskeys are blended. When you make grain whiskey, which is from corn, rye, wheat, anything of that type, it's getting distilled in a column still. Now, most grains lack the enzyme to convert starch into sugar. Therefore, to help with that, what you need to do is you add a little bit of malted barley. That malted barley triggers the reaction from taking place, starting that reaction to take place. And then what you have happen is the conversion from starch into sugar, which then we're going to convert from sugar into alcohol. Now, Irish whiskey has grain and malt whiskeys. Single malt whiskey, for all of you, those of you who are here, thank you for coming. Single malt whiskey is still blended whiskey. It's single distillery, all malted barley. Single malt. If it's got a 12 on the bottle, that's indicative of the youngest whiskey in there. Sometimes you're not going to see an age expression because they're building to a certain type of recipe, family recipe. And that's the case here with Teeling. We have a single malt whiskey with Teeling, but it actually is all malted barley, but it's instead of just resting in ex-bourbon barrels in American oak, it's rested in 5 different types of casks. And the whiskeys in this single malt whiskey are between the ages of 7 and 23. Now, this distillery opened up in 2015. Construction began in 2012. But when they made their sale of the Cooley distillery, their family distillery, what they did is they took all that resting stock with them to Ireland, and those are the expressions you're seeing in the first, we're now 5 years into the expressions of Teeling whiskey. And so what they've done for their single malt whiskey is they've got casks resting with malted barley, so distilled single malt distillate in California Cab Sav wine casks, white Burgundy, port, sherry, and Madeira. All 5 of those casks are going to impart different flavors to the malt as it's aging and resting and harmonizing and evolving and maturing into the expression that it's going to be. And so you have this really interesting dry single malt whiskey with notes of berries and nice tannins. You get some red fruit. You still get that real strong malt characteristics. And then we've got a single grain, much like single malt. This is a blended whiskey, but it's all grain whiskey. So 95% corn, 5% malted barley. To recap, you're using the malted barley to trigger that reaction so that the starches can convert to sugar, the sugar can be converted to alcohol. The interesting thing with this family is that they're focusing on experimental cask finishing. We have a master blender who's from Portland, Oregon. His name is Alex Chasko, And he really focuses on using a unique method of aging in all different types of barrels that he can source. So this single grain whiskey is aged up to 7 years, but all in California cab sav wine casks. So it's not seeing any ex-bourbon, it's all California wine. So you're gonna have nice dry grass notes, you're gonna get some red berries, get some good fruit, some nice sweet flavors to it. It's got a bit of a honey component. And then the one that we're gonna mix with today, for those of you who are here and you're thirsty and you're feeling like you need a little pick-me-up, we're gonna make an Irish coffee, but we're gonna use the core expression, the small batch. This is a blended Irish whiskey, 3-part corn whiskey, 1 part malted barley. The corn whiskeys are getting distilled through a column still, much lighter in style. You're gonna have nice heat from it. The 25% malted barley that's going there is going through a copper pot still. Now, there's a whole set of properties that take place when you're distilling whiskey. Grain whiskeys are lighter, malt whiskeys are more pronounced in flavor. So what they're doing is they're aging them separately for between 4 and 5 years. They're blending them and vatting them, and then they're finishing them in Caribbean rum casks. So of their whiskeys, this one sticks to what most people know of as whiskey, and that it's seen time in ex-American bourbon barrels. American oak, up to 4 to 5 years in that for both the grain and the malt whiskeys, blended and vatted in neutral in a stainless steel vat, and then they're put into a rum cask. That rum cask is going to just layer this in complexity. But the Irish whiskey, the Irish coffee, was a cocktail that was created way back in the day by a gentleman named Joe Sheridan. There was a lot of flights that would go from Russia to the United States. They would stop at Moyes Airport in Dublin. And on one of those flights that was heading to America, they had to turn back around. Now, these air-weary travelers were met by this gentleman, Joe Sheridan, and Joe Sheridan decided to make them a cocktail that would pick them up. That would kind of get them some energy to kind of get them through this tough time. And so it's a simple recipe. You're using a Demerara sugar. Demerara sugar is a refined sugar from molasses. Unlike white sugar that has had all the molasses removed, Demerara sugar has a little bit of color to it, a little bit of molasses left. So this is just a Demerara syrup. You can tell it's a little bit darker. It's got a bit of, it's almost like a brown sugar. Irish whiskey, fresh hot coffee, and cold cream. So what we're going to do to make this drink, we're going to do 1.5 ounces of Teeling small batch. Now, all these Teeling whiskeys are available at Jack's, and don't sleep on them. You know, as this category is one of the fastest growing spirits categories in the globe right now, this is a wonderful way to get reintroduced to a very, very special type of whiskey. So we've got a small batch, a single grain, a single malt. There's another one known as a pot still. This is very unique to Ireland. We'll get to that in a minute. I got my 1.5 ounces of Irish whiskey in my glass. I'm going to put a 1/2 ounce of this Demerara sugar, just to sweeten things up, give it a little bit of body. And then I'm going to add my hot coffee, right? This is just a wonderful rich espresso. I'm going to leave a bit of room because we're going to finish this off with the magic on this cocktail. And I've got myself a whipping cream that I've slightly sweetened with a vanilla syrup. Vanilla syrup is very simply a bean that's been sliced open and boiled in water to concentrate that water as if you're making a vanilla tea. And then from there, you're adding sugar once you've filtered off all of your solids. So I'm just going to put this in cold into my shaker, and I'm going to make an a la minute whipped cream. Excuse me. So nice and quiet, but this is going to thicken up. You don't need to go too abrasive with it, but you want it to be nice and thick and creamy. It's going to have a nice texture. It's going to just incorporate into our coffee a little bit more. Whew. You can see it's got some thickness to it. It's going to just sit on top. You get a nice little layer. I probably could have put a little bit more on there, but I don't want to have too much cream and not enough whiskey in my coffee. So this is a Teeling Irish coffee. Just to recap, 1.5 ounces of Teeling's Irish whiskey, their small batch, a 1/2 ounce of a Demerara sugar, and then about 4 ounces of freshly brewed coffee, and you're just going to top it up with a little bit of cream. If you want a little bit more cream on top of that, that's no problem. Fill your glass, however you need to do it. But the amount that I put in my shaker today yielded that amount. Now, this is going to lend texture. It's going to lend a bit of sweetness. It's going to have a nice fatty texture because it's going to help the coffee. Now, this distillery is a family-run distillery, and it's a real pleasure to be working with them because they're so innovative and they're so progressive in their approach to the whiskey category. You know, unique barrel finishing, grain sourcing, the things that they're doing. They also use, when you're fermenting your malt, you have to convert starch into sugar, you're going to convert the sugar into alcohol. That happens through the process of fermentation. Grain, water, cereal grain, water, and yeast. When you combine those three, fermentation starts taking place. At Teeling, what we use are pine fermenters. They're Oregon pine fermenters, and pine is a fantastic thermal conductor. And what that means is that it's going to hold the heat for the fermentation within the fermentation tank. If you're using a stainless steel fermentation tank, steel and metals give off and absorb heat quite quickly. And so it's a lot harder to control the temperature within the fermentation tank. And so at Teeling, with these pine fermenters, what it does is it traps that heat in there and it allows that fermentation to take place. It's such a beautiful process. The smells are rich. Now, all three of these whiskeys are very different. Your small batch whiskey, 3-part corn, 1-part malted barley, finished in rum casks, ripe fruits, big full maltiness. You're going to get some nice texture from the corn. You're going to have some good grain and oak flavor profiles in that. Your single grain is going to be a little lighter. It's going to have more of those breakfast notes. This would be considered a breakfast whiskey in Ireland. Drink how you do it responsibly. Just make sure that you're taking care of yourself when you go for it. And then your single malt, very different. Single malt whiskeys, as we all know, single distillery, malted barley. But what they do, and typically in Ireland, is you are aging that whiskey in an ex-bourbon barrel. But we're using port, sherry, Madeira, white Burgundy, and California Cab Sav. Those are 5 very unique casks, all different oaks, European and American. So those oaks are going to behave. They impart flavor. They're going to have a bunch of congeners, and congeners are an umbrella term for flavors in spirits. And so you're going to have some nice fruit. You're going to get dry notes. You're going to get a bit of spice from the Madeira. You're going to get a touch of honey, or not honey, pardon me, touch of ginger. And so you've got all these different things that are interacting in harmony, aged separately, blended, put in the bottle. It's just a fantastic way to enjoy it. So to quickly recap, we're sipping on some Teeling Irish whiskey today. We're going to be drinking an Irish coffee once the camera's off. And it's 1.5 ounces of Teeling small batch, a 1/2 ounce of Demerara sugar. Demerara sugar is a sugar made from molasses that has molasses left in it. And then 4 ounces of coffee, and finished off with a fresh whipped cold cream that's been slightly sweetened with a bit of a vanilla syrup. So easy process, very straightforward drink. It's going to stay warm. It's a toasty day, or it's a toasty day inside, but frosty outside here in Vancouver. And if you find yourselves out at a Jack's liquor store, anywhere in the Lower Mainland, do yourself a favor. Say hi to their wonderful staff. Pick yourself up a bottle of fantastic Teeling Irish whiskey and enjoy your drinks at home. Irish coffees are straightforward. This recipe will be posted when we get it up. It'll be on Jack's page. It's always a pleasure to work with these wonderful people. This liquor store has done such a tremendous job of sourcing really great spirits from around the globe. And we're happy to be here and support. And we're happy to be having this opportunity to speak to you guys about Teeling Irish whiskey. So once again, my name is Kevin Brownlee. It's been a pleasure to be here. We got 2 more amazing weeks coming up the next few Thursdays. So please tune back in next Thursday, and I look forward to seeing you then. I'm going to scroll back, see if we've got some questions. So if you're still here, I'm going to answer it if you've got them. Excuse me. Do you recommend? Oh, thank you, Mr. Fisher. I even brought, look at that. This fine fella, don't forget to finish your Irish coffee with some freshly grated nutmeg. Good call out. Wow, thank you, sir. Nice one. So yes, finish your drink. You know, the nutmeg is going to be nice, right? It's going to give you a bit of an aromatic expression that's going to be different than the flavors of the coffee. The spice is going to work with some of the whiskey notes as well. So scrolling back. Hello to everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Got no questions from the crowd. We got some nice, yeah, siempre tequila. ¿Qué pasa, amigos? Wonderful. Nothing better. Yeah, that's right. So those of you that main difference between Irish and Scottish whiskey. So great question. Thank you for that. So one thing to note, oftentimes, historically, Scottish whiskey was made using peat. And so what that means is that when you take that malt, you take that barley, you have to soak it. You have to soak it in water to trick it to opening up. Because what we need to do is we need to access the carbohydrates inside to turn starch into sugar. Those sugars are going to become alcohol. But you don't want it to fully germinate. if your malt fully germinates, you're not going to have sugar to turn into alcohol. And so you have to stop that germination process. And by doing so, you take your malts after they've soaked and you lay them out wet on a floor. It's a malting floor. It's perforated. And in Scotland, oftentimes the main fuel source was peat. Peat is moss. It grows under, it's a bog, and so it's wet. They burn it. That peat smoke rises up, attaches to the wet barley as the barley's drying over the hot air, and that peat imparts a smoky, iodine, campfire type note. They rarely use peat in Ireland. Ireland is usually just hot air, and so they're not imparting that flavor profile. Part of it was that they wanted to differentiate from Scottish whiskey at the time. While they both might use single malt whiskey, barley, making barley whiskey, making single malt, Scotland is often using peat. Ireland is rarely used as peat. That would be a big significant difference. The other is the flavor profile. In Scotland, you need to be aged for 3 years in oak. In Ireland, 3 years in any wood. So there's some different ways that you can approach imparting flavor. The grain selection, the fermentation time, the shape and size of the still, and the wood and casks collection are all 4 factors that any master blender and distiller can control when they're making whiskey. Then there's factors that are outside of the control. The environment in the storehouse. Where was the grain source? What is the terroir like? Is it from a biodynamic farm? Is it from an organic farm? Those get into far more complex things than we're going to dive into today. But the biggest difference is the flavor profile. Scottish whiskey may have some peat, a little bit, more robust in some ways, and Irish whiskey typically uses malted and unmalted barley. So in an unmalted barley whiskey, like a pot still style whiskey, you're going to get more cereal notes. It's going to be a little bit grainier. You're still going to get some of that oak. You're going to get nice sweetness and a round, full flavor. There's more corn used in Irish whiskey in the blending process. And so Scotland and Ireland are quite different, but both fantastic. So, excuse me, I saw some questions roll in. Other easy at-home cocktail ideas. Could you use small batch in typical rum-based cocktails? Oh, excellent question. So, as we mentioned, the Teeling small batch has a rum cask finish. So for those of you cocktail enthusiasts at home, what you can consider doing when you're making your tiki cocktails is using a Irish whiskey that's going to have some really wonderful cask finish notes from that Caribbean rum cask to use in your cocktails. Irish whiskey will play a lot like a young aged rum in some respects. You're going to get good spice, you're going to get good malt, good oak. You're going to get some red berries and a bit of dry grass from this small batch. So the small batch plays perfectly into your tropical style drinks. You think big full fruits, passion fruits, citruses, oranges, pineapple juice, things like that with the tiki style of cocktail. Teeling small batch whiskey is perfect for. Great question. Just going to scroll up here. Main difference, we got that. Well, wonderful. Well, for those of you here, thank you for being here. For those of you who have departed, thank you for coming. Jack's Liquor, it's always a pleasure to be here with you talking about spirits. Thank you for having us here to discuss Teeling Irish Whiskey today. I look forward to seeing you next week. Peace.